He thought humiliating her would be easy, but in less than a minute, that entire gym would learn a lesson no one would ever forget. The late afternoon light poured through the tall glass windows of Iron Forge Gym, casting long reflections across the polished mats as the steady rhythm of gloves hitting pads echoed through the space. A place where reputation meant everything and respect was earned through sweat and discipline. And at the center of it all stood Jason Reed, a black belt known not just for his skill but for the confidence that bordered on arrogance, the kind of man who believed he could read people the moment they walked through the door. And that was exactly what he thought when Emily Carter stepped inside, wearing a simple gray hoodie, worn sneakers, and no sign of experience that anyone could see. She moved quietly, almost invisible against the energy of the room, her eyes calm as they took in the surroundings, the heavy bags swaying, the sharp commands from instructors, the subtle hierarchy that defined who belonged and who didn't. And Jason noticed her immediately, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. And in a place like this, that was enough. He walked over with a smirk that had become second nature, glancing her up and down as a few nearby students slowed their training just enough to listen. "You sure you're in the right place?" he asked, his tone light, but edged with something sharper, something meant to entertain the crowd, already beginning to form. And a couple of students exchanged amused looks, one of them chuckling under his breath as Emily simply nodded once, her voice soft but steady. "I'm here to train." And for a brief second, something unreadable passed through her expression, but it was gone before anyone could catch it. Jason let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he gestured toward the mat. "This isn't a beginner fitness class. We take things seriously here." And the words landed exactly how he intended, drawing a few more laughs, the kind that spread quickly in a room full of people eager for entertainment. And somewhere near the back, a phone lifted slightly, ready to capture whatever was about to happen. Emily didn't react, not the way most people would, no defensiveness, no embarrassment, just a quiet stillness that didn't quite fit the moment. And that stillness made Jason lean in just a little more, pushing the moment further. "Tell you what," he said, louder now so more people could hear. "Why don't we do a quick round, just for fun?" And the word fun echoed with a meaning everyone understood, a harmless show, a quick demonstration, something to prove a point. And the circle widened as students stepped back, anticipation building in the air like a held breath. Because in this place, moments like this weren't just about training. They were about status, about who belonged and who didn't. And as Emily slowly reached up and tied her hair back with deliberate care, her movements calm, almost detached from the noise around her, there was a shift, subtle but real, something in the room that changed without anyone fully understanding why. And Jason, still smiling, still certain, stepped onto the mat, completely unaware that the story he thought he was about to control had already slipped beyond his grasp. And in that quiet second before anything began, before a single move was made, the gym felt different, like the air itself was waiting. The circle tightened as the faint squeak of sneakers against the mat echoed through the gym, and what had started as casual amusement slowly shifted into something more focused, more curious, as everyone leaned in just a little closer. Jason rolled his shoulders with practiced ease, still wearing that confident half smile, the kind that came from years of being the best in the room, and he gestured lightly as if to say this would be quick, nothing serious, just another moment to remind everyone of the order here. But Emily stood across from him with a posture that did not match the situation at all, her stance relaxed yet grounded, her hands loosely positioned, not tense, not uncertain, just ready. And that quiet readiness did not go unnoticed by the few experienced eyes in the crowd. Near the edge of the mat, an older student named Marcus narrowed his gaze slightly, something about her balance, the way her weight settled evenly, the absence of hesitation. It did not look like a beginner, not even close. But the moment moved too quickly for doubt to fully form as Jason stepped forward, initiating what he clearly expected to control, his movements confident and measured. But in that instant, something subtle happened, something most people would have missed. Emily shifted just half a step, barely noticeable, yet perfectly timed, and suddenly the rhythm Jason had set was no longer his to lead. The room seemed to inhale all at once as the exchange unfolded, not with chaos, but with precision, each motion from Emily deliberate, efficient, almost effortless. And within seconds the dynamic had changed completely, not through force, but through control, through timing that felt almost unreal to those watching. And Jason, who had approached with certainty, found himself adjusting, recalculating, his expression tightening ever so slightly as the confidence that once filled the space began to thin. No one laughed now. The earlier murmurs replaced by a growing silence that pressed in from all sides, broken only by the faint hum of the gym equipment in the background. And then it was over, not with spectacle, not with noise, but with a stillness that spoke louder than anything else could have. Jason remained where he was, momentarily frozen, not from harm, but from realization, the kind that arrives without warning and leaves no room for denial. And Emily stepped back calmly, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. And for a long second, no one moved, no one spoke, until a quiet voice from the back cut through the silence, hesitant but unmistakably clear. "That technique, where did she learn that?" And another voice followed, lower, almost disbelieving. "I have seen that before, but not here." And the shift in the room became undeniable. Curiosity replacing judgment, respect replacing amusement. And Jason slowly straightened, his eyes now fixed on Emily with a completely different understanding than before, the kind that comes when assumptions fall apart in real time. And yet, even in that moment, the biggest question had not been answered, because Emily Carter, the quiet woman in the gray hoodie, had not explained anything, had not claimed anything. She had simply shown enough to change everything, and somehow left even more unsaid. And that silence carried weight, the kind that made people lean closer, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. No one moved at first, as if the entire gym had forgotten how. The earlier energy replaced by a heavy, almost electric stillness that lingered in the air. And Jason Reed, who had always been the center of attention in this room, now stood quietly, his usual confidence replaced with something far more measured. His eyes locked on Emily Carter, as though trying to understand a puzzle that did not fit any expectation he had ever relied on. The faint sound of a dropped water bottle somewhere in the background seemed louder than it should have been, snapping a few people back to reality. But even then, no one laughed. No one whispered the way they had before, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone. Marcus stepped a little closer to the edge of the mat, his gaze sharper now, studying Emily with the kind of focus that came from years of experience. And he spoke again, this time more certain. "That footwork, that control, that is not beginner level." And a few others nodded subtly, their earlier amusement replaced by a growing respect they had not expected to feel. Emily, however, did not acknowledge any of it. She simply adjusted her sleeves slightly, her movements calm, grounded, as if she had stepped into this exact moment 100 times before and knew exactly how it would unfold. And that quiet confidence only deepened the mystery surrounding her. Jason finally exhaled slowly, straightening his posture, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, the edge of mockery gone, replaced with something more careful, more aware. "Where did you train?" The question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as a genuine attempt to understand. And for the first time since she walked in, all eyes were not judging her, but waiting for her answer. Emily looked at him for a brief moment, her expression unreadable, and then she gave the smallest hint of a smile, not proud, not dismissive, just quiet, and she replied simply, "Different places." And nothing more, no explanation, no detail, just enough to confirm what everyone was beginning to realize without satisfying their curiosity. And that only made the silence heavier. In the far corner, the person who had been recording lowered their phone slightly, as if unsure whether they had just captured something ordinary or something far more significant, and whispers began to form again. But this time they were different, softer, filled with speculation rather than ridicule. "She moves like someone who has competed," one voice said, while another added, "or trained at a level we do not see here." And the realization spread quietly, not through loud declarations, but through the way people shifted their stance, the way they looked at Emily now, no longer as an outsider, but as someone who had stepped into their world and revealed a truth they had overlooked. Jason nodded once, almost to himself, processing everything in real time. and though he did not speak again immediately, the respect in his posture said enough. But even then, the story was not finished, because beneath Emily's calm presence, there was still something hidden, something not yet revealed, and as she turned slightly, preparing to step off the mat as if this moment meant nothing at all, Marcus's voice came again, quieter but more intense. Wait, I think I know who she is. And just like that, the room held its breath once more, because whatever came next was going to change everything even further. Marcus's voice did not rise, but it carried through the silence with a weight that made everyone listen, and Emily stopped mid-step, not abruptly, but just enough to acknowledge that the moment had shifted again. All eyes turned toward Marcus now, a man who rarely spoke without reason, and the uncertainty on his face made the room feel even smaller, tighter, as if everyone had unknowingly stepped into something far bigger than a simple training session. Jason's gaze flickered between them, his posture no longer relaxed, his earlier confidence replaced by a focused stillness as he waited, not for a challenge, but for an answer that would explain what he had just witnessed. Marcus took another step closer, studying Emily carefully, not with judgment, but with recognition that was still forming, still incomplete. A few years ago, he began slowly. There was a regional circuit, invitation only, people who trained at a different level, and a few older members in the gym exchanged glances, the kind that said they had heard of it, but never seen it up close. There was someone there. Marcus continued, his voice tightening slightly. Someone who moved exactly like that. And the room seemed to lean in as one, the quiet deepening into something almost tangible. Emily did not interrupt, did not deny. She simply stood there with the same calm presence, her expression steady, giving nothing away and yet confirming everything without a single word. One of the younger students whispered, barely audible, "What do you mean, different level?" And Marcus exhaled softly before answering. The kind where mistakes are not corrected, they are prevented. And that sentence alone changed the atmosphere completely, turning curiosity into something closer to awe. Jason's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in realization, as pieces began to fall into place. The precision, the timing, the effortless control, none of it had been luck, none of it had been a fluke. And for the first time since he had stepped onto that mat, he understood that he had not been leading that exchange at all. Emily finally shifted her gaze toward Marcus, just briefly, and there was a quiet acknowledgement there, not pride, not challenge, just a recognition that he had seen enough to understand part of the truth, but not all of it. The tension in the room held for a moment longer before Jason took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not defensive, just measured, and he spoke again, his voice lower now, stripped of any trace of mockery. "You could have said something." And Emily met his eyes calmly, her response simple and steady. "You did not ask." And that answer settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, because it was not just a statement, it was a quiet reflection of everything that had just happened. No one had asked who she was, they had only decided what she was not. And now that assumption had been dismantled in the span of seconds. A few students looked down, others shifted uncomfortably, the earlier laughter now feeling distant, almost embarrassing, as the full meaning of the moment sank in. Marcus shook his head slightly, still processing, and murmured, almost to himself, "If it is really you, then this was never a fair comparison." And that sentence hung in the air, incomplete, unresolved, because even now, the full truth had not been spoken aloud. And Emily, instead of stepping into that recognition, simply turned. Again, as if ready to leave the center of attention behind. Her quiet presence unchanged despite everything that had shifted around her, and somehow, that choice said more than any explanation ever could, leaving the entire room standing in a silence that no one was quick to break. Emily's footsteps were soft against the mat as she stepped away, but the silence she left behind felt heavier than any sound that had filled the room before, and no one rushed to speak. No one dared to return to normal as if nothing had happened, because something had shifted that could not be ignored. Jason stood still for a moment longer, then slowly nodded, not to anyone else, but to himself, as if accepting a truth that had arrived without warning. And when he finally looked up again, his expression had changed completely, the arrogance gone, replaced by something far more grounded, something earned in real time. Wait, he said, his voice calm but firm enough to stop Emily before she reached the edge of the mat, and she paused, turning slightly, her eyes steady, giving him the space to speak, and for a brief second, it seemed as though the entire gym leaned into that moment, waiting to see what he would do next. Jason took a measured step forward, not as a challenger, but as someone choosing his words carefully. I misjudged you, he said, the sentence simple, direct, and carrying more weight than any explanation could have, and the room felt it, the shift from pride to humility unfolding in plain sight. Emily held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, not triumphant, not dismissive, just acknowledging the honesty in his words, and that quiet exchange seemed to settle something deeper than the moment itself. Around them, the students began to relax slightly, but not completely, their attention still fixed, their understanding still catching up, as whispers formed again, softer now, filled with respect instead of doubt. Marcus crossed his arms slowly, watching the interaction with a thoughtful expression, and then he spoke again, this time more certain. You came here for a reason, and it was not a question, but a statement that carried an expectation, and Emily's expression shifted just slightly, the first real hint that there was more beneath the surface. She glanced around the gym, taking in the faces that had changed in the span of minutes. The same people who had laughed now standing quietly, listening. And then she spoke, her voice calm, steady, and clear. I did, she said, and the simplicity of that answer only deepened the curiosity in the room. Jason tilted his head slightly, no longer assuming, no longer leading, but asking, why here? And Emily's eyes moved briefly. Across the space, the equipment, the students, the structure of the place itself, before returning to him. Because places like this shape how people see strength. She replied, and the words landed differently than expected, not as criticism, but as something closer to a reflection. A few students exchanged glances, uncertain but listening, and Marcus gave a slow nod, as if he understood more than the others. Emily continued, her tone unchanged, and sometimes that perspective needs to be tested. And that was all she said. No grand reveal, no detailed explanation, just enough to make everyone in that room realize that what had happened was not random, not accidental, but intentional in a way they were only beginning to understand. Jason exhaled slowly, absorbing her words, and for the first time, he looked around his own gym as if seeing it differently, as if questioning something he had always taken for granted. And in that moment, the hierarchy that once felt so clear now seemed less certain. Emily turned once more, ready to leave the center of attention behind. But this time, no one saw her as an outsider. No one questioned whether she belonged, because she had already answered that without saying it. And as she stepped off the mat, the room remained quiet, not from shock anymore, but from respect, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. And in that silence, everyone understood something they had not before, that strength was not always loud, not always obvious, but when it revealed itself, it did not need to prove anything further. The gym did not return to normal, not right away, because once something true is revealed, it lingers, it reshapes the space around it. And as Emily stepped toward the edge of the mat, the usual sounds of training did not resume, the rhythm of gloves and commands replaced by a quieter awareness that settled over everyone present. A few students instinctively straightened their posture. Others adjusted their stance as if suddenly aware that they had been watching more than just a demonstration. They had witnessed a standard being quietly redefined. Jason remained where he was for a moment longer, his eyes following Emily not with judgment, but with a kind of reflection that had not been there before. And when he finally turned, his voice carried across the room again, not loud, but clear. Everyone, reset. And yet even that simple instruction felt different, less like an order, more like an invitation to begin again with a new understanding. The students moved, but slower, more deliberate, the earlier confidence replaced by something more thoughtful, and Marcus stepped closer to Jason, speaking low enough that only those nearest could hear. You see it now. And Jason gave a small nod, not defensive, not dismissive, just honest. I do, he replied, and that admission, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything he had said before. Across the room, Emily reached for her bag, her movements unhurried, as if the moment had already passed for her, as if what had just happened was not something she needed to hold on to. And that quiet detachment only added to the presence she carried, because it made it clear she had nothing to prove, nothing to gain from attention. One of the younger students hesitated before approaching her, unsure, but drawn by curiosity that had replaced earlier assumptions. "Excuse me," he said carefully. "How long have you been training?" And Emily looked at him with the same steady calm, considering the question for a brief second before answering. Long enough to know that it never really ends. And the simplicity of that answer left him silent, not confused, but thoughtful, as if he had expected something more concrete and instead received something deeper. Nearby, another student lowered his gaze slightly, replaying the earlier laughter in his mind. The ease with which judgment had come, and the discomfort of that realization settled quietly, not forced, not spoken, but understood. Jason watched this unfold, his perspective shifting not just about Emily, but about the space he had built, the culture he had shaped, and for the first time, he saw the gaps, the assumptions that had gone unchallenged, the moments where confidence had crossed into certainty without question. He took a slow breath, then turned back toward the class, his voice steady, grounded. "Skill is not always visible," he said, and the room listened, truly listened. "And respect is not something you wait to give." And there was no lecture in his tone, no performance, just a statement shaped by what had just happened, and it landed with a quiet force that did not need to be repeated. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag and headed toward the door, the soft sound of it opening cutting through the room. And for a brief moment, several people looked up, as if realizing she was leaving without ever explaining who she really was, without confirming what Marcus had suspected, and yet somehow, that absence of explanation felt intentional, as if the lesson had never been about her identity, but about their perception. Marcus watched her go, a faint smile forming, not from amusement, but from recognition, and he murmured quietly, almost to himself, "Some people do not need to say who they are." And as the door closed behind her, the gym remained still for one last second before life slowly returned, but not the same as before, never quite the same again. Because that day, without raising her voice, without seeking attention, Emily Carter had changed something fundamental, and everyone in that room knew it, even if they could not yet fully explain why. The door had barely settled back into place when the subtle rhythm of the gym began to return, but it was no longer the same rhythm, no longer driven by noise or ego, but by something quieter, more intentional, and Jason Reed felt it immediately as he watched his students move, their focus sharper, their movements more deliberate, as if each of them was now aware of something they had overlooked before. He walked slowly across the mat, observing in silence, noticing details he might have ignored just an hour earlier, the hesitation in a stance, the imbalance in a step, the difference between someone performing and someone truly understanding. And for the first time in a long while, he was not looking to correct, but to learn. Marcus remained near the edge, arms still crossed, his gaze thoughtful as he followed Jason's movements. And after a moment, he spoke again, not loudly, but with the kind of certainty that carried weight. "You built this place on discipline," he said, "but today reminded everyone what discipline is supposed to lead to." And Jason paused, considering that, then nodded slowly. "Clarity," he replied, and the words seemed to settle into the room like a quiet anchor. Across the gym, the younger students who had laughed earlier were now practicing in near silence, their earlier confidence replaced by a focus that came from realization rather than instruction, and one of them, the same student who had asked Emily a question, stopped mid-movement and adjusted his footing, not because someone told him to, but because he understood something he had not before. The shift was not dramatic, not loud, but it was real, and it spread through the room in small, steady ways. Jason stepped toward the center again, his presence no longer commanding attention through volume or authority, but through a calm that had been sharpened by humility. And when he spoke, everyone listened without being asked. "What you saw today," he said, "was not about winning or losing." And the words carried none of the usual intensity, only clarity. It was about awareness, and a few heads nodded, not out of habit, but because they felt the truth in it. Marcus gave a faint smile, recognizing the shift not just in the room, but in Jason himself, and that change mattered more than anything else that had happened. Near the entrance, a new student hesitated before stepping inside, pausing as if sensing something different. In the atmosphere, something harder to define but impossible to ignore, and for a brief moment, the entire space felt like it was holding onto the lesson that had just passed through it. Jason glanced toward the door, then back to his class, and there was a quiet understanding in his expression, one that had not been there before, because now he knew that strength was not something you displayed, it was something you recognized, something you respected before it ever needed to prove itself. And somewhere beyond those walls, Emily Carter walked away without looking back, her presence already fading from the physical space, but what she had left behind remained, woven into the way people moved, the way they thought, the way they saw each other, and in that unseen shift, the real impact of her visit began to take hold, not in a single moment, but in every moment that followed. The evening stretched on, but the atmosphere inside Iron Forge Gym carried a quiet weight that refused to fade, and even as the sounds of training returned, there was a noticeable difference in how every movement was made, slower, more intentional, as if each person was now measuring themselves against a standard they had only just discovered. Jason stood near the center, watching closely, not with the detached confidence he once carried, but with a focused awareness that caught details he had long overlooked, and it was in those small observations that the real impact of the moment revealed itself, because nothing dramatic had changed on the surface, yet everything beneath it had shifted. A pair of students practiced footwork nearby, their earlier rhythm replaced by careful adjustments, one pausing mid-step, correcting his balance without being told, while the other mirrored the change. And Jason noticed, a small nod forming as he recognized that learning had begun in a way no instruction could force. Marcus leaned against the wall, arms folded, his gaze steady as he took in the room, and after a moment, he spoke again, his voice calm but certain. They are not just training now, they are paying attention. And Jason exhaled slowly, the truth of that settling in. That is what we missed, he replied, not as an excuse, but as an acknowledgement, and Marcus gave a slight nod, understanding that the realization mattered more than the mistake. Across the gym, the younger student who had once laughed now moved with a quiet determination, his expression focused, his posture more grounded, and when he finished a sequence, he did not look around for approval. He simply reset and tried again, and that subtle change spoke louder than any correction ever could. Near the entrance, another member approached Jason hesitantly, glancing toward the door Emily had exited through. "Do you think she will come back?" he asked, and Jason paused before answering, his eyes briefly following the same direction. "I do not know," he said honestly, "but I think that was not the point." And the member frowned slightly, trying to understand, but Marcus stepped in quietly. "Some people do not return," he said, "because they were never meant to stay, they were meant to remind." And the words lingered, carrying a clarity that settled deeper than expected. Jason turned back to the room, watching his students with a new perspective, and for the first time, he saw not just their skill, but their potential, the kind that could be shaped not by pressure, but by awareness, and he understood that what had happened was not a challenge to his authority, but an opportunity to redefine it. The gym lights reflected softly across the mats as the session continued, but the energy was no longer about proving strength, it was about understanding it. And that difference changed everything. Outside, the sky had begun to dim, the last light of day fading as Emily walked farther away, her presence now only a memory within those walls, but the effect she left behind continued to unfold in ways no one could fully measure. And back inside, as the final rounds of training slowed, the room fell into a quieter rhythm once more, not from exhaustion, but from reflection, because everyone there knew, even if they could not put it into words, that they had witnessed something rare, something that does not happen often, the moment when perception is broken and rebuilt, and in that shift, something stronger takes its place. By the time the session finally came to an end, the gym had grown quieter than usual, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper that lingered beneath the surface, and as students wiped down equipment and gathered their belongings, there was a noticeable pause in their movements, a kind of reflection that had replaced the usual rush to leave. Jason stood near the center of the mat once more, his arms relaxed at his sides, watching as each person carried themselves a little differently than before, more aware, more deliberate, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of responsibility that extended beyond technique or performance, something rooted in how people were seen, how they were treated before they ever had the chance to prove themselves. Marcus approached slowly, his expression calm, almost satisfied, as if he had been waiting for this shift all along. And he stopped beside Jason without speaking at first, allowing the silence to say what words did not need to, until finally he said, "You cannot teach that kind of lesson." And Jason gave a small nod, his gaze still fixed on the room. "No," he replied quietly, "but you can choose whether you ignore it or carry it forward." And that choice settled between them with quiet clarity. Across the gym, the younger student who had once laughed now paused before leaving, glancing back at the mat as if committing the moment to memory. And when he turned away, his posture held a new kind of respect, not just for others, but for the process itself. And that was the real change, the kind that did not fade with time. The lights dimmed slightly as the evening staff prepared to close, casting softer reflections across the floor, and Jason finally stepped toward the entrance, his eyes resting briefly on the door Emily had walked through. And though she was long gone, her presence still felt undeniable, not as a person, but as a moment that had redefined something fundamental. He reached for the door, then paused, as if considering something, before turning back one last time to look at the space he thought he knew so well. And in that quiet second, the truth settled fully into place. That strength is not something you measure by appearance, not something you assume based on what you see, but something you recognize through humility, through the willingness to look again when your first judgment fails you. Marcus watched him from across the room, a faint smile forming as he saw the understanding take hold. Because that was the real outcome, not the exchange on the mat, not the silence that followed, but the shift in perspective that would remain long after. Jason opened the door and stepped outside, the cool evening air meeting him as the noise of the city carried on unchanged. And yet for him, something was different. Something had been reset in a way that could not be undone. And inside Iron Forge Gym, as the final lights dimmed and the space fell into stillness, one thing remained clear to everyone who had been there that day. Even if they never spoke of it again, that respect is not earned in the moment you prove yourself. It is given in the moment you choose not to underestimate someone. And that was the lesson that stayed, long after Emily Carter had walked away without ever needing to say who she truly was.